What is life? Why am I here? How is it all connected? And how am I going to navigate this beautiful but crazy journey? I'm Sylvia and welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast. Today I'm talking to Brandon Srot. Brandon is a psychotherapist, a leadership development coach and facilitator who has dedicated his life developing human potential and connection. Inspired by questions of human existence, the meaning of life and purpose, Brandon welcomes you into an authentic partnership of discovery and growth. His practice is supported by key developments in neuroscience, somatic awareness and trauma-informed care. Whether journeying through important chapters of your life, developing your leadership approach, or experiencing the magic of facilitation, Brandon's humanistic style allows you to explore, grow, and become who you truly are. Welcome to the Soul Sunshine podcast, Brandon. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
I know, it's so excited. I'm really excited about our chat today. It's a rainy, cold day in Sydney, so I'm just cuddled up here in my blanket and in my Ugg boots, and I'm just really looking forward to chatting to you.
Me too. It's a wonderful day for the conversation.
Exactly. So, Brandon, today we are talking about all things trauma. We are talking about what comes to mind when people think of trauma, how we define it, and what it actually really means. We are talking about how you know that you're carrying trauma and how that trauma can also hold you back in life. We are also exploring some initial steps for you to take to start resolving the trauma that might be present, and how we can find our way back to ourselves so we can live a life true to ourselves without being victimized by old patterns and stories. So, Brandon, we met in 2018 at the Chaos Pilot Masterclass that we both attended, and I always laugh when I think back of that time, because we were in the same working group and I was really fascinated by the work that you do and by your background and everything. And I really wanted to chat more with you, but I was also at that point pregnant with my second child, which nobody knew, right? And I remember sitting there and just literally concentrating on not vomiting for 2 days. And it was so funny because I remember you saying you thought that I was really quiet, and yeah, it was just funny thinking back of that, going like, oh my God, one day I can tell you guys why I'm literally not talking for 2 days.
And here we are.
Exactly, here we are. Very
They were a great few days together.
Yeah, they were awesome.
Yeah.
It's a very, very cool concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into our conversation, Brandon. So, as a psychotherapist, one of the things that you specialize in is trauma and grief work. When we're talking about trauma, it's such a huge word, and people probably think of different things when they think about trauma. So I would like to know from you, what does it mean and how would you define it as a professional, because there would be so many definitions out there.
Absolutely. And thanks for the question. And again, thanks for the opportunity to be here in this conversation with you. I think a lot of the time when people think about trauma, they think about specific events, and they may define trauma by their understanding of particular events. But what I think about in terms of trauma is more about what's going on in the body, more about what is trauma at a physiological level and at a kind of neurological level, beyond just the events that may be defined as a traumatic event. So from that kind of internal physiological, neurological place and space, it's my understanding that trauma really relates to a heightened state of arousal of the central nervous system in the human body, and that heightened state of arousal, when it occurs for a prolonged period of time, can actually impair our ability to integrate that experience, that event that has happened to us. And so when we are in a prolonged state of kind of fight-flight, which is a natural function of the body and a natural function of the brain, but when we're in that prolonged state of fight-flight, it can really overwhelm us at that kind of nuclear level And that's my understanding of trauma. Like what happens to us when we are overwhelmed to the point that we can't actually integrate the event or the experience that has happened to us.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it pretty much means that we can't integrate what's happening to us, and that's why the trauma occurs. Is that correct?
It doesn't mean to say that every bad experience or bad event is traumatic, but what may differentiate one bad experience from another is that the intensity of one of those experiences may be so great that we can't actually hold that experience. We can't process it. We can't integrate it. We can't make sense of it. And our body doesn't know how to manage the enormity of that experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when we're talking about trauma, and we're going to obviously go a bit deeper into that, but what I'm also interested in is when somebody comes to you in therapy, why is it so important to look at trauma?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why is it good to look at trauma? I think it's good to look at trauma because if we don't look at it, if we don't seek to resolve or integrate those experiences that have had such a profound impact on us, a few things may occur. One is that we may live our lives feeling unsafe, and we may move through our days, our weeks, our years, our life, alert, hypervigilant, on guard, not feeling safe in the world, not feeling safe in our family or our community or our relationships. Another part of it is that, in my view, if we don't look at trauma and seek to resolve it or integrate it, it can impact our personality and it can change how we think of ourselves. It can change our understanding of who we are ourselves and how we interact with those around us. And lastly, I would say that it impacts our relationships because a lot of trauma is relational. A lot of trauma happens from person to person and between people. So if my main frame of mind is that people hurt me, people cause injury to me, then what's that going to mean for my ability to form safe, secure, trusting, loving bonds and connections with other people? And so on those three levels, I think that there's a merit to having the courage to look at and work through our traumas.
That's really interesting as well when you're talking about how it can impact not only the way we show up in the world and that it can make us feel unsafe and that it can potentially impact relationships with others, but that it can also impact our personality. I think that is really huge because it's obviously something pretty big that has to happen in order for that to occur. So I really want to go a little bit deeper into that and see how would people know that they have experienced a trauma and that there are those changes happening. If you're not really aware of it or if you're not really literate with it, what would be some of the signs that that has happened? Because I'm imagining people would go through things like that all the time in different areas in their lives and not really realizing what it does to them.
Yeah. And I think I would just begin by saying here that sometimes we do know that we've been through a trauma and sometimes we don't know that we've been through a trauma. If it's happened particularly at a very young age, we may not have kind of conscious memory of what's happened or what happened. And beyond that, we may also repress what's happened to us. That's a function of the brain to kind of manage and cope and allow us to continue to exist and function. So sometimes we don't actually know that something's happened to us. And that can be really tricky because sometimes it may appear like the remnants or the tremors of that trauma may appear in different and unexpected ways. So for example, it may begin to appear in our dreams in very strange or convoluted or illogical ways that we don't necessarily know what that actually means yet, but it may pique some curiosity for us. Or it may begin to appear in bodily sensations, like we might begin to notice that every time I speak to a certain person, something happens in my body, or every time I go to a room in the house or a certain part of the city that I live in, or every time I hear about a particular event, that sort of thing, that it might trigger something in me. And I may not actually know what that's about, but it might again pique some curiosity. And the third thing I'll say here is that sometimes it can manifest in terms of our kind of well-being and our health. So we might experience issues with our gut, skin issues, digestion issues, that sort of thing. Now, I'm not a medical doctor and I don't profess to give any kind of medical advice here, but it's always worth checking those things out. It doesn't mean to say that they're necessarily trauma related, but sometimes there can be a symptom of a trauma. And often we find that if there is no medical explanation for a symptom or a condition that someone is experiencing, we may find something else going on at a psychological level through the therapeutic intervention. So that's kind of when we don't know that we've had a traumatic experience. And sometimes we do know that something happened to us, but sometimes we don't give it enough credence, in a sense. Sometimes we minimize it, or we may downplay it, or we may just say, oh yeah, that thing happened when I was 5, but I'm 45 now and it's 40 years later. And that can also be a little bit tricky sometimes, because these very early experiences in our lives really play a big part in forming the template for how we live our adult lives. So it can sometimes be very worthwhile to go back and explore what happened and what that means to us and how we've processed that and how we haven't processed that and all those sorts of questions. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And it brings up 2 points for me as well. The first is that when you were saying, the way it can manifest in your life, for example, is, you're talking to a certain person and you get this strange feeling, or you're going to a room or to a place in the city and you get this weird feeling. I guess it doesn't necessarily then have to do anything with this particular person, even necessarily. It's just that that person potentially reminds you or brings up something in you that your body remembers as that traumatic experience that you've experienced previously. Is that correct?
That's right. So our brain responds to stimulus. And so when we sense or feel or see or hear a particular stimulus that reminds the brain of something historical, the brain may go into automatic respond mode and do what it did back at the original time, historically, to keep you safe. And that's why you're absolutely right. I may see someone on the street. I may not even know them. I may not even know their name. It could be something really nuanced, like the hair color or the clothing that they're wearing, or even the scent of their fragrance. And that can maybe trigger something in me, right? That has nothing to do with that person who's an absolute stranger to me, but it triggers something that is familiar to my brain, and it can transport me back, in a sense, to an earlier experience. And that early experience could be a childhood experience, but it could also be something that happened yesterday or 5 years ago. It doesn't always have to be a childhood experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that came up there for me as well is when we're talking about the fact that it could have happened when you were 5 years old, or, when you were a young child, or even later. It's also the fact that whatever has happened to you, you could have been traumatized by something potentially that another child or another person wouldn't have been traumatized by, just by the psychological makeup that you're having. So something that's affecting you a lot more might not affect somebody else. But that's why it's then so important, and not brush it under the carpet and be like, oh, that happened when I was 5. It was silly. I was a child. It didn't even matter, It's like, well, yes, it did matter, because when you were 5, it was a very hard thing for you, and for whatever reason, you've taken this to heart, and it has obviously left the mark that you still need to resolve now. So I personally really think that there is so much value at looking at those early years. And like you said, the whole conditioning that you've been given, in those early years, and what is serving you well and what is potentially also holding you back in life now.
That's right. And we know from the research that experiences of childhood trauma are the number one predictor for whether or not an adult will land up in the mental health system.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it
And
makes sense, doesn't it?
it makes sense, absolutely. And so when we haven't had the opportunity to integrate, to process those experiences, that can have really long-term lingering effects on our well-being at an individual level, but also at a systemic level in terms of the broader community and society. Yeah.
So, Brandon, would you say, looking at trauma as a whole, would you say there is any chance any of us can get away without experiencing any sort of trauma in their life? You know, it feels like everybody, every person has experienced one or another trauma at some points in their life, whether they know it or they don't. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. My personal opinion is that, and that's not a professional opinion, my personal opinion is that we all experience traumas. Some are capital T traumas and some are little t traumas. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But my personal view, and from what I've seen and heard working therapeutically for over 10 years now, is that it's kind of inescapable. I will caveat that by saying professionally now that what I might term traumatic may not be what you term traumatic. And, I do absolutely have a lot of clients who resist the term traumatic or trauma. They don't identify with that word. And that's okay. They don't need to. And it's not about necessarily even labeling it. It's more about the process of integrating a life experience for each person or each system. But in the work that I do, I kind of see trauma and grief actually everywhere. And I think right now, living through a pandemic, the trauma is huge. Whether we've had COVID ourselves or not, whether we know someone who's died or not, just living through it and dealing with the ruptures to our daily life and dealing with the grief that it has generated for so many around the world, that is traumatic for a lot of people. Isolation, quarantine can be a traumatic experience for a lot of people. So I think we're living in quite a traumatic time right now.
Yeah, we certainly are, aren't we? And it's like you said before, something that's traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me or vice versa. But I feel like with COVID and living through this really taxing time at the moment, one day you feel fine, the next day you just feel like crying because, I don't know, in my case, I haven't seen my family for years. I haven't been back home for ages. My children are growing up and, they haven't seen anybody for so long. My little one hasn't even been back to Austria. So, it's that fact of one day you're fine, but one day you're not fine. And, for some people, it might be harder than for others because there is job loss, there is people not being able to see their families, their friends, there is the illness itself. How has that affected you? But when you're talking about the big traumas versus the little traumas, where would COVID fall in there for you right now? And what would be some of the other examples that you can give us? The big traumas, but then also what would be some of the, small traumas that we might not necessarily identify as traumas?
Yeah. So I think some of those big T traumas are things like a natural disaster or a violent death or rape, assault, physical abuse, those sorts of things. And it may be something that we've experienced or something that we've observed or witnessed.
They are the traumas that I think people would identify as traumas, right?
That's right, that's right. Whereas the little t trauma, and I will add here too that while I do find it useful to think about big T and little t, I don't mean it in a diminutive way. I just kind of mean it more in like a classifying sense. But some of the little t traumas might be things like inconsistent caregiving. If you were a child who didn't have an emotionally available parent or caregiver, that can be quite traumatic. It can be hugely traumatic. Or emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, or misattunement. Maybe it was in your family of origin, or maybe it was a significant relationship in your adult life where there was such a high level of misattunement between you and your partner. That can be quite traumatic. Or bullying, We're seeing so much bullying right now, particularly for young people in schools. And increasingly, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of bullying in the workplace. That seems to be growing. That can be pretty traumatic. So those are some examples that come to mind. In terms of COVID, for some people, this is a capital T trauma because maybe a loved one has died and you haven't been able to be by their side or be at the funeral or be home with your family if you're living in a different country, right? For other people, it might be a little T trauma because maybe there's just a lot of loss and grief in their life and they've heard of people dying, but they actually are quite safe at home. But maybe they haven't worked for 6 months, right? And maybe they're struggling to afford food for their family from week to week. That could be quite traumatic for a lot of people. There's a whole range and a whole variety of traumas out there.
And so what does usually happen when a trauma occurs? How does your body and your mind react to that? It is that body, mind, spirit connection that's happening there.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's probably a lot to say there. I hope I remember all of it to offer here. The one thing I'll kind of preface by saying here is that, again, not every stressful event is traumatic. So we may have a lot of stressful events in our lives in which the fight-flight response gets activated, that alarm system goes off in the body, in the brain, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that event, that experience is closed and resolved and we can make sense of it. But when it's too much, that event, when that fight-flight system is activated for a prolonged period of time, that's when it can become traumatic. And it can be overwhelming for our brain to hold what's happened to us. So there's a few brain functions that may occur that help people in one sense to manage what's happened to them. And I guess a very common example is what we would call dissociation, which is quite literally when the brain goes offline for a moment or for a few moments or for a few prolonged moments. And we may disconnect from the here and now. It may kind of look or seem like someone's daydreaming when you can tell they're just not here. You may be talking to them or sitting in a room with them, but you can just see through the look in their eyes or through their body language that they're somewhere else. That may be an example of dissociation. And so in the healthy range, dissociation happens because the brain has to disconnect from the enormity, the overwhelm of the experience that it's had, the traumatic experience that it's had. And that can actually be a healthy thing for the brain to do. It can also become problematic when that is a persistent function that the brain entertains and when we don't know how to regulate that ourselves, even when we're removed from the traumatic stimulus. So that's one example, dissociation. There's also things like minimization, which we spoke about earlier, where we might convince ourselves or tell ourselves that it's not as important or it's not as traumatic or it's not as big a deal as what happened to my neighbor or my friend or my partner or my colleague. And then the comparing begins and then we minimize. Or the brain may actually repress what happened. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of when we don't even know that something's happened to us, where it's just so grand, the event, the overwhelm is so enormous that the brain automatically represses it. It pushes it out of awareness. It pushes it out of consciousness so that we don't have to think about it. We don't have to remember it. We don't have to feel any of the feelings that are associated with that event. So that's a form of repression. And then we have a whole bunch of what we call in the Gestalt community creative adjustments or coping strategies that people may employ or use at different times to manage the overwhelm or to manage the pain of what's happened to them. And that can really range from anything like alcohol, gambling, drugs, work addiction, sport addiction, people pleasing, social withdrawal, all these sorts of things. And they're going to be different for different people, but there's a whole variety of ways in which we will find ways to adjust to what's happened to us just in order to stay safe, right? And again, it's my view that at the time of the event, at the time of the incident, these may have been healthy adjustments that we had to employ, that we had to put in place in order to maintain some sense of equilibrium or safety in our lives. And in that context, it may make a lot of sense, right? But in another context, it may actually be unhelpful or unhealthy or at odds with our intentions for life. And so that's the sort of thing that we would want to examine and explore in therapy too. How can we adjust the adjustments?
I'm going to go into the therapy side of things in a minute, but out of your answer there came a few questions from me as well. So you're talking about repression and that sometimes it's easier literally to just completely push it out of consciousness, to not remember it because the pain is just too overwhelming.
Yeah.
And the question around that for me that comes up is, does that happen mainly when trauma happens when you are really young? Let's say when trauma happens to you when you're a child and you're just completely forgetting all of that and moving on with your life. And the older you get, the less you remember that particular thing that happened to you. Or is this also something that can happen to you as an adult or later on in life when something really overwhelmingly happens, that your brain and your body is actually capable of repressing it, completely pushing it out of your consciousness, like you said? That's really interesting that we are even capable of making something that has happened to us completely go away in a way, I mean, it's not gone away, of course, it's still there subconsciously, but your consciousness is making it just disappear, just so that you can pretty much survive and keep on going on, keep on
That's right.
living on.
Yeah. I think that repression can happen across the lifespan, but obviously we do see a lot of it in earlier years. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons for that is that the brain is not fully formed when we're young, right? It forms as we age and mature. And so in those earlier years of life, the right brain, which is more connected to emotions, is a lot more active in earlier years. So we're going to be feeling the kind of emotions of what's going on in our life a lot more acutely. And we may not even yet have language to talk about or explain what's happened to us at that young age, because that is the part of the front brain which comes later in development, right? So I think that when we are so exposed and so vulnerable to such heightened emotion, there may be a correlation there in terms of a greater need to repress that which is just completely overwhelming and unbearable to hold. Whereas perhaps later on, when we have access to the front brain in a kind of more developed and mature way, we might then have language to talk about what happened or to understand what happened. We might have more logic, more rationale to get perspective on what occurred and what didn't occur and all that sort of stuff, to be able to think about it in a different way or in any way. But certainly that is less available to us the younger we are. And perhaps that accounts for that earlier sort of repression. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. And I've also heard the fact that, for example, when children don't remember parts of their childhood, it's because of that. It's because they're almost choosing not to remember it. They're almost choosing to forget it because it wasn't the way that they were hoping. Pretty much.
That's
that
right.
It wasn't a loving environment or whatever it may have been. But yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is very fascinating. The brain is capable of so much, and it has all these functions and capabilities to keep us safe. I always think about safety in terms of trauma work. What did our brain and our body learn to do, often in very creative and genius ways at the time, to maintain equilibrium, to keep us safe in the best way that it knew at the time, right? And then it may be 45 years later or 10 years later to now, how do we then reevaluate other ways for staying safe and keeping safe?
Yeah, exactly. And that was actually the other question that came out of the creative adjustments and the coping strategies that you were talking about. You were talking about alcohol abuse, drug abuse, as, just one of many. Is it sometimes easier to escape reality with those coping strategies and mechanisms rather than to deal with the trauma that's present for somebody?
Yeah, I think it can be more tempting, perhaps, and easier, in inverted commas, to numb the pain that is often associated with a traumatic event or traumatic events than to face up to what happened, what it means for oneself, etc., etc. And also because sometimes we don't have the support that we need to go on that journey of exploring what happened to us. And sometimes the only support we have is the bottle of wine or the pokie machine or the people that we see at the pub every day, right? And so it can be very courageous work to pull back the curtain on these sorts of traumatic events in our lives. And I believe that we need to have the right support in place to allow for a productive exploration. But sometimes at various points in our lives, we don't have any other support. There's a lot of loneliness out there and disconnection, isolation. And so sometimes, yeah, the bowl of wine is our best friend.
And it's about being ready yourself as well, right? It's about you in yourself knowing that you want to take that step and that you want to actually work through them, because it is very challenging. And I'm going to get into that as well a little bit later. But out of that as well, how do you think can trauma that we are carrying around with us, how can that hold us back in life as well? Because it's such a profound impact on us. Like you said before, it impacts our personality, our relationships, just generally how safe we feel in the world. So what's the impact on our life when we're walking through it with all the trauma that's unresolved?
Yeah. I was very fortunate to be able to attend a training in Sydney with Bessel van der Kolk just before the pandemic hit, so in February 2020. And Bessel van der Kolk is one of the leading authorities globally these days on trauma. I highly recommend his work to any of your listeners. And one of the things that he spoke about in this training workshop was how trauma can affect the brain. And I think this relates a bit to your question. So the first thing he was saying is that unresolved trauma can enrich the threat perception part of the brain, right? And this goes back to the safety point. So that alarm system in the brain that is there to kind of alert us to potential threat, whether it's real or perceived, is heightened. It's further enhanced or enriched. So he was saying that when that part of the brain, which is there to alert us to danger or threat, whether it's real or perceived, is enhanced, it means that it never turns off, right? It means that we're always in a state of survival. It means that we're always on the lookout for danger. It means we're always hypervigilant for our safety needs. And that can be something that actually holds us back, because in an overstretched sense, if it's prolonged and enduring, it may mean that we're never able to calm ourselves or to rest or to be present in a conversation with someone or to, enjoy a music concert or to go to the beach and enjoy the sunset, all these sorts of moments of life, because we may always be scanning for our safety needs. So that's one kind of dimension of impact. The other is he talks about how the filtering system in the brain gets, in a sense, damaged by trauma. And what that means, the impact of that, is that it can be a struggle for us sometimes to discern between what's relevant right now and what can wait till later, right? What do I need to focus on right now? And what can I do tomorrow? And the impact of that, if we play that out in our mind, is that it can become really difficult to focus, right? And that can cause fogginess and blurriness in our mind. And it can create agitation and it can create frustration because we may have a lot of things to do, but we don't know how to necessarily organize them into priorities because that kind of filtering system has been damaged in a sense. And then the third piece that he talks about is that our self-sensing system in the brain, which is kind of more connected to some of the midline structures of the brain, that these also get damaged in some sense. And what the impact of that is that it might mean that our experience of ourselves gets blunted. We may not actually know how to experience ourselves, or that's where we might see things like disconnection from self, because it was probably a coping mechanism back at the time when the event happened or the events happened, right? That we had to kind of disconnect from ourselves. We had to stop feeling whatever we were feeling because that was too much to bear. So in a prolonged sense, we may actually experience a kind of disconnection from ourselves. And obviously the work then is, how do we reconnect? I hope that answers the question.
Totally, it does.
Yeah.
And it actually brings me to my next point as well. And I haven't seen the documentary myself yet, but there is a new documentary out at the moment, which is called The Wisdom of Trauma. And it's by Gabor Mate, I think you said.
Mate, yeah.
It's funny when I was reading it because it's spelled M-A-D-A, so it's like mate, you know. In
Mate.
Australia, you would say Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate. You said it right.
I think it's Mate.
Mate. Well, he's Hungarian,
but I could be wrong.
Canadian.
He's Hungarian.
I'm
yeah.
not really sure. So it's a documentary, obviously, on trauma. And he says, I've just watched the trailer so far, and it says that every human being has two genuine, authentic selves. And the trauma is the disconnection of it, and the healing is the reconnection with it. And it fits in what you were just talking about. You know, it's the disconnection of things. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that particular quote as well, and why do we get disconnected in the first place there?
Yeah, I'm quite new to Gabor Mate's work, so I'm not an authority on any of this for that matter, but particularly on his work, though I do find his work particularly compelling and fascinating and relevant. So I do resonate with what he's saying here. And I think we disconnect because we had to disconnect in order to survive. Like maybe there was a feeling that was just too unbearable to feel. Or maybe there was a hope or an ambition or a yearning that we had of our caregiver that they just weren't able to fulfill. And so rather than linger in the disappointment, we had to let go of the dream, the hope, right, in order just to manage and cope with what is. And so I think that all these things that kind of, how do I explain it? All these things that were just unbearable, too much, too heavy, too large to make sense of. We just had to disconnect from them, dissociate from them, because they were perhaps too challenging and they may have threatened our safety in some sense. And I kind of think of them sometimes as just floating around in an orbit around us. You know, as we move through life, we have all these bits and pieces and all these different parts that just float around us. And that maybe the process of working through trauma is finding a way to bring them back into us, to kind of fill us up again or to complete us in some way. And it doesn't mean to say that they all have to come into fruition or they all have to eventuate, but that we can hold them in some way can be very fulfilling. I see that as a process of integration in some way too.
And so talking about integrating those things in yourself again, talk us through a little bit about the approach that you're using in order to work with clients that have gone through trauma.
Yeah. Well, I'll say here that, you know, when I initially trained in my field, I was taught a very different way of working with trauma to what I do now. When I trained, I was still in that kind of era of thinking that you work through trauma by talking about the trauma. And so I have a lot of clients who come to therapy for the first time And their expectation is that they're going to sit down on the couch and talk about what happened to them. And that's actually a very difficult expectation to manage sometimes for a lot of clients, because they can be very steadfast about the fact that they're coming here to let it out, right? And they might cry, they might shout, they might kick, or do whatever they need to do just to tell the story of what happened to them. But where I've shifted in my practice, and where I would say I'm shifting in my practice, it's still an ongoing process, is a bit more nuanced and a bit more new age in terms of what we're learning about working with trauma. And so I'm adopting this approach of what's called the bottom-up approach. And where this comes from is that basically when we experience trauma, the pathway of how trauma impacts and affects the brain is from the bottom up, meaning the first part of the brain that is impacted by trauma is the reptilian brain, the brainstem, right? It's right at the bottom of the brain. The next part that is impacted or affected is the limbic brain, which is the middle part of the brain, which is the emotional part of the brain. And then the third part is the front brain, which is the cortex, where we have access to thinking and logic and reason and some elements of memory and language, right? So when a client comes to therapy and wants to talk about it, they're accessing the front brain because they're talking about what happened, right? But that doesn't actually help or resolve any of the other two layers of the trauma and the impacts of the trauma. So where I'm shifting to now, and what I'm learning more about more recently, is how to actually begin at the bottom of the brain and work upwards towards the front of the brain. And that might begin with ensuring in the first instance that a client is actually resourced to later on talk about what happened to them. They may actually never talk about the trauma, or they may only talk about it in 5 or 6 or 25 or 35 sessions from the beginning. But absolutely the primary task is to make sure that a client is resourced, that they can manage their breathing, that they can manage their arousal states in their body, that they can be present and not dissociate, right? That they can be in the here and now, that they feel safe. And these sorts of processes can take time to develop. It's not a given that anyone can just regulate themselves. It's not a given that everyone will feel safe in any space, let alone the office of a therapist that they've just walked into for the first time in their lives. So there's all these kind of earlier processes that I believe need to, and which the research is showing, need to occur and be put in place before we even get to the event or the events themselves, and then begin the meaning-making process. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally, because you need to make sure that your client feels safe and secure and held, and is then able to be vulnerable and open up when the time is right, so to speak, or when they are ready to work through that, you know, because it can,
right.
Like you said, it can be quite overwhelming to go and just tell potentially the worst thing that has ever happened to you to a complete stranger that you're seeing for the first time, you know?
That's right.
So I mean, I guess I get both, because there's probably that I just want to tell you and I just want you to help me.
Yes.
Meanwhile, you are like, we need to build this up. We need to make sure that you're safe and you are, that you're well held in that approach.
That's
you know?
right.
And that we're looking at every single part of what we need to actually work through in order to make a difference overall.
Yes, that's right. And so it's not necessarily a linear process. You know, that's my fantasy as a therapist, that we'll start here and then go to stage 2.
Yes.
That would be lovely.
I think that's also the fantasy from every client, you know?
Yeah,
that they come
that's
to you
right.
and be like, oh, we just tick this box and then we go to the next one and then
Exactly.
I'm walking out better
Yes.
again in 3 hours.
That's right. So sometimes a client may just walk in and begin venting or sharing or offloading the event or the events, right? But then I may need to find ways of coming in a very kind of safe, gentle way to maybe help slow them down so that they're not dysregulating themselves, so that they stay resourced and grounded. And I'm always thinking and trying to find ways of doing that in a safe, gentle way. I don't want to be the person who says, I'm just going to stop you now, Sylvia. Can you take a breath? Because even though it may be coming from a great place, for me to talk to you like that, it may sound aggressive. It may be triggering. There's a gender axis going on there. There's maybe a power relation. So I might say something more like, would it be okay with you if we just took a moment here to pause, right? Then you have the choice to say yes or no, right? I'm not asserting that you need to do something, but we can actually work it out together. And I find that clients tend to respond to that sort of approach a bit more. We talk a lot in this work about the window of tolerance, and I think that's maybe an important concept to just mention here. The window of tolerance refers to a range of experience in which we feel in control, we feel regulated, we feel safe, we feel okay about ourselves and about the world. And the size and the depth of that range is going to vary for different people. It's not a one size fits all, right? So I might be able to tolerate X, and you might be able to tolerate X plus Y plus Z, right? But when I'm in that range of experience, I'm fine, right? What the window of tolerance basically teaches us is that if I go beyond that range, I may actually become aroused or dysregulated. And that may be triggered by a whole variety of events or experiences. And sometimes I might go north and sometimes I might go south. So if I go north, out of my window of tolerance, that is often correlated with the fight and flight response, right? That I might kind of engage in a variety of responses, behavioral responses, physiological responses that are about activation, and go into that threat response, fear response, survival response. And similarly, if I go south, I might go into the freeze response, which is correlated oftentimes with a sense of deadening, like withdrawal, freezing, silencing, muting, that sort of thing. And what we know from the research and from practice is that when a client is outside of their window of tolerance, it's actually not productive for anyone, right? So our work, particularly at these very early stages of therapy, is to A, teach clients this concept of the window of tolerance so that they have the frame in their own mind, and B, to support them to stay in their window of tolerance as much as they can. Now, we will naturally, just throughout life, move up and down and between these various states, but hopefully we have enough awareness and enough skills and resources to know what we need to do when we're feeling beyond the window of tolerance, whether it's north or south. For some people, I might get triggered when I'm talking about the event, and then you might notice that they're talking really fast, or they're not breathing, or they're going flustered, or they're getting clammy, or whatever it is. That might be a cue that they're getting aroused and that they need to come back into their window of tolerance. For some people, it might be experiencing a particular emotion, right? There's like a myth that it's a good thing to cry in therapy, that that's successful therapy if someone cries. It's not always the case, because sometimes if I cry in therapy, I might start to heave in tears. My body might start to shake. I might not be able to control the intensity of that particular emotion, right? And then I need to learn to find a way to come back into my window of tolerance. Only then are we better primed, better poised to continue the process. Otherwise, it's actually a bit re-traumatizing.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I just wanted to say, because if you're talking through your trauma, depending on obviously where you are on your healing journey, but it is you reliving the trauma at the same time while you're talking about it, because your brain can't really differentiate between you talking about it necessarily and the experience that you've had in the past. So it's kind of reliving it again. And that can be very hard, And then as a therapist, you then also need to make sure that by the end of your session, like may this be an hour and a half, your client needs to leave in a safe space, and they need to feel like they're okay to walk out again and, work through things and then come back again for the next session.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It can be very triggering, re-traumatizing, and our responsibility is to make sure that our clients feel safe. I think you're right that when we talk about it, it may be reliving it because the brain may think that it's actually in that moment again. And I think that when the body and the brain experience safety while we're talking about what happened, that helps to shift the sense of time in the brain, right? And that can mitigate the sense of re-traumatization, that I can talk to you about what happened to me. We can talk about what that meant, how I felt, how I processed it, all that kind of stuff, when I'm feeling safe in the here and now, because I can only be safe in the here and now, right? It wasn't safe back then at the time of the event. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's also, in that scenario, they're always able to go as far as they're able to go, as far as they're ready to go, because you can only work through what you're ready to work through. You can't push yourself either. Like you said, it's not necessarily a linear process, but it is a step-by-step process of uncovering things and working through them bit by bit.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm really interested when you're talking about the bottom-up approach, and you potentially have somebody that comes in and doesn't want to just blurt everything out straight away. By listening to your clients and by watching them and their body language, do you get a good understanding of the severity of the trauma or the problem that's underlying it? If somebody doesn't come in and tell you their whole story and you're like, okay, this is the problem, this is what we can work on. How do you start that process? How do you gauge, or can you even gauge what the severity of the problem may be? Or is it an uncovering as you journey along with somebody?
It definitely is an uncovering, I think. What I like to do a lot of the time is collect data. So whether a client is talking or not talking, whether they're very extroverted or very quiet and introverted, I'm basically looking for data, like how are they being in the space right now? And how are they being in this relationship, the therapeutic relationship with me, right? Do they feel safe? Do they look safe? Do they look distracted? Are they able to reflect on what they're talking about? Are they getting aroused? I particularly look at people's breathing patterns in therapy and facial expressions. But the thing is that I hold all of that very lightly, because I guess the risk is that I could think that everyone has a trauma and that's what they're here for. That's not my job. It's a collaborative endeavor. But I'm holding all this data very lightly as a hypothesis for what may be going on. And it may only become relevant in session 25 or session 4. It may not be relevant straight away. But it's important data to, at some point, feed back to the client as little cases in point. Like, I noticed that this happened when you said that, or when I asked you this question, I noticed that you did A, B, and C, whatever it is, right? Sometimes it's appropriate to share that sort of feedback. Other times it's not appropriate, and there's no kind of golden rule. But in terms of the severity, I will defer in the first instance to the client to determine the severity of the event. In my view, it's their story, it's their life events, and it's their right to kind of take ownership of that narrative. There have definitely been occasions where I have shared my own view on what the client has expressed to me, particularly when I felt that they've minimized the event. And so I might say something like, gosh, that sounds really awful to me, right? Because maybe they were saying it was okay, it wasn't so bad. And that might dial up the level of severity a little bit. I don't want them to buy that idea, but I just want to see how it lands with them. Maybe they'll say, oh yeah, you're right. Or maybe they'll say, nah, you actually got it wrong. It wasn't that bad, And then I must believe the client. They are the experts of their own story. So it's kind of a little bit of an art because we're working it out as we go, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. And so when you're talking about working it out as well, and I understand that this next question that I'm asking you is probably an impossible one to answer, really, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Because, we all, like everybody who has had an experience in the past with going through therapy or coaching or anything like that, probably can relate to the fact that you're going to your first session, let's say, and you're thinking, oh, I'll have like 1 or 2 sessions and I'll be fine again, I'll walk out and everything will be awesome again. And it doesn't obviously work like that, right? It's like you're going there because there's obviously something that's really bothering you that you need to work through. And in my experience as well, if you start working on yourself, the more you work on yourself, the more you actually uncover that you then need to work through. But overall speaking, how long does it take that people can start seeing improvements in their day-to-day life and in their struggles with whatever the trauma or whatever the issue may be? Is there a time frame that you can put on that? Or is that just really too hard to say? Because every problem is different, every person is different, every story is different, really.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a question I get asked all the time, particularly when a prospective client will call me to make an inquiry or to book an appointment. They'll often always ask me, how many sessions do you think I'll need, Brandon, to resolve whatever it is I'm coming to therapy for? Look, I do think that there are some things that have very finite or smaller timeframes around. Like, I know that there's some very successful treatments for phobias that can be treated in like 10 to 12 sessions. Do you know what I mean? But I think that when it comes to something like trauma, it's like, how long is a piece of string? For some people, they might come for 5 sessions. They might come for 5 years to therapy because of the trauma. It's really hard to know. My approach with clients is I'll work within the frame of whatever they have available to them. Like if they say I can come to see you every week or every second week or once a month, and that's all I can do right now, I will work with them to make that happen for their own benefit. And I let my clients decide how long they want to stay in therapy for. I don't tell them that it's like a 20 session or whatever it is. It's for them to decide. And I've definitely had clients who, I still have clients who have been coming to therapy for 10 years. They might do 6 months here and then a year there and then 3 weeks here, and then they might just check in every couple of months. But there's a therapeutic relationship that endures over a long period of time. And I actually think that the therapeutic relationship is very helpful for a lot of trauma work because, again, a lot of trauma happens in the relational space between people. So when people experience a sense of safety and trust and presence and non-judgment, where they can be free and they can be themselves and they can express whatever on their mind and feel held in that, that can go a long way for healing and integration. There are some studies that suggest that actually the vast majority of change in therapy can happen very early on in the therapeutic work, like in the first session or the first few sessions. And I've definitely seen that over the years, not always with trauma work, but in other sorts of clients that I work with. Like I had a client once who on session 2, I don't know what I said to him, but he came back to me and he said, oh my God, that's exactly what I needed to hear. And that just makes so much sense to me. And that just solves all the questions in my mind. Thank you so much. And I never saw him again.
Amazing.
Now he could have been lying to me. Like maybe he just wanted an out, right? But maybe he wasn't. And that's maybe what he needed at that time. And that's all he needed, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't trauma work that he was working through. It was more like a work issue. So, but I do think that with trauma, it tends to be longer term work. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to really understand that, you have experienced the trauma, and then, as we've discussed today as well, it has manifested in your mind, in your body, in your outer world, for your
Yeah.
whole life pretty much. So
Yeah.
may that have been 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but something that has been going on for such a long time is not going to be resolved in 2 or 3 sessions. It's also
That's
being
right.
realistic about what can be achieved in which time frame, and I guess being patient with yourself and your progress as well, not coming out of the first or the second session going like, I can't even figure it out here, like kind of having that lens on yourself. It's like, no, you have to be patient and you have to give yourself time to resolve it the same way it took time to build it up to that.
That's right. And I think we live in a particularly complex world right now where we do tend to expect things instantaneously, and so there is like a growing expectation, I think, in the therapeutic and healing communities that I can come in and you'll fix me and then I'll be okay, right? And that it will happen in 1, 2, or 3 sessions. But actually, you're right. As you say, this is process work. This is not just about fixing a sore thumb or a broken arm, right? This is about mending our soul, our spirit, our mind. And that's process work that can take time over time. Yeah.
And it's really interesting when you're saying, when somebody says you can fix me, that's the other thing, right? Because you are not fixing anybody. People are fixing themselves. It's like you are supporting them on their journey to uncover things and support them in the ways that they need in order to work through different things that have happened to them so that they can live a more fulfilled and a more loving and a happier life.
That's right. And, I was saying earlier about kind of just gathering data, in the beginning especially, but as the work continues from the things clients say, that's often the one thing that I'm noticing and looking for. How are they talking about this work? Are they telling me that it's my job to fix them? Are they telling me that it's my job to give them the solution? Or do they see themselves as part of the solution, right? And how do they talk about it or not talk about it? That's a very important thing that I tend to want to gather data around, because we know from trauma-informed care that empowerment is one of the key tenets of trauma-informed care and treatment. And so it's always at the front of my mind to want to build the client's sense of empowerment to really take ownership for their life, right? And it's so funny to me sometimes. So often people will say to me, just give me a strategy. Just tell me what to do this week. Right? And I hate doing that, but sometimes I do. And they never come back having done the task or done the exercise. I don't think people really want to be told what to do at the end of the day. But if you find out what you want to do for yourself, if you are able to craft your own homework exercise or your own intervention or your own experiment, that could be really, really empowering. And so that's always actually how I like to work with my clients.
And it's that shift that happens from you are helping me rather than I'm feeling empowered to help myself, right?
Yes,
which is, I think, at the beginning can be quite overwhelming because it puts the burden back on me, and it means like, okay, I have to get through all of this now. I have to go and work through all of this. But once you've gotten over that initial like, oh my God, it's back on me again, it does feel empowering because you're like, okay, I've actually got it in my own hands and I can do whatever it takes to work through this. And I've got you there on the other side supporting me, helping me with your strategies and your beautiful work that you're doing. But then it's up to me to really take it on, and to really,
that's right,
work through it myself.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of clients come to therapy thinking that they're broken, and maybe they've been diagnosed at other parts in their life with particular conditions or disorders, which I hate that word. But I never ask people what's wrong with you. I always ask my clients what's happened to you, And I think that when people feel like they're the problem, they don't see themselves as part of the solution, right? But when they are able to see that there's a story here, there's a story about their life, there's been a sequence of events that have happened, and that when we can find that narrative and we can wrap the narrative around their story, they often feel emboldened by that and empowered by that. And then are able to see themselves in a much more active way as part of their own journey and healing process. That for me is therapy. I don't need to fix people. I don't think anyone's broken. I think we're all just doing the very best we can with the resources available to us at those various points in our life.
That was so beautifully said, Brandon. Thank you so much.
You're
for
very
that
welcome.
Closing statement. I think it's a beautiful place to finish this conversation for today, even though we could keep talking now, but you can keep going as well. Thank you so much for taking the time
You're
out
so
today
welcome.
to talk to me. It has been an absolute pleasure, and it's such a fascinating topic and such a deep topic. There's so many facets to it, and there is so much more to it than what we've even talked about today. But it's been such a great conversation, and just to really open up that conversation, and exploring it with you. Thank you so much for that.
You're so welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to join you in this conversation. And I also want to honor and congratulate you really for putting this conversation together and for putting it out there for your listeners and for the world. I mean, I just think that trauma is so underspoken, and I think we all need to really deepen our understanding, deepen our vocabulary around what it is, what it's not, how it manifests, all that kind of stuff. And so you're making a big contribution to that in the world, and I think that deserves recognition and acknowledgement too. So thank you so much for everything you're doing in this world.
Thank you, Brandon, for your kind words. That really means a lot. I mean, conversations like these are exactly the reason why I'm doing this, because I feel like those conversations need to be heard. They need to be had. People need to talk about it. It's something that, just needs to happen.
Absolutely. And maybe we'll have another conversation at another point.
I have so many questions still in my head, and I know I would love to keep asking you them, but I know that you have to go. But there's definitely other topics in there that I would love to explore with you and unpack with you. So
I look forward to it.
Maybe in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brandon, there has been so much wisdom and knowledge in this conversation today. Thank you so much for sharing all your expertise. And there's a lot of things that I'm taking away from today. But I think in order to summarize the episode today, the three main pieces of wisdom that came out for me were when we're talking about trauma and how it can manifest. It can manifest in three ways in your world, which is you can feel unsafe in your world and in your surroundings. Your personality can change. It can have really profound effect on how you are as a person, and it can also affect relationships around you. So if you notice one of those things happening to you, maybe just think about where that might come from or what might have started that in the first place. The second point is some of the coping mechanisms that our brain is using to cope with trauma, which is dissociation, which pretty much means you're disconnecting from the here and now. You're not here anymore. You're somewhere else. You might see somebody looking into the distance and you're like, they're not really here. That's kind of that feeling. The second one is minimization, is when people are downplaying things, when it's like, no, it wasn't actually that bad, or that happened when I was 5. That doesn't matter anymore in my life now. And the third one is repression, where your brain is pretty much trying to completely forget what has happened to you, where the pain is just too much. So your consciousness is just completely trying to get rid of the experience. And the third point is when you're talking to somebody about what's happened to them, their trauma or issues in their life, whatever it may be, Brandon has explained it really nicely as the window of tolerance, which is a range of experiences where we feel safe, and the size and the depth of that is different for each and every one of us. But if you're getting out of that window of tolerance to the north side, it's like the fight and flight. Suddenly you're like in a panic, and it's coming back from the day when we used to run away from bears, while we were hunting, etc. And then there is going south, where you are going in total freeze modus, where you just can't function anymore as a person, and you're like, something's happening. So if you are in that window of tolerance, that is where you can actually help and support people. And that is where the most progress can be made, working through different issues with people as well. So Brandon, we've also mentioned a few resources today, so I will put them into our podcast notes. So for people that are really interested in the topic, they can go and they can read more about trauma, what it entails, etc. So if you are interested in the work that Brandon does, if you need to work through something yourself, if you would like to work with Brandon, please do get in touch with him via his website. It's brandansrot.com.au, BRANDONSROT. Again, I'll put it in the podcast notes, so it's all there for you. Or you can also find him on Instagram under @BrandonSrot. Do get in touch with Brandon if what you've heard today really spoke to you. He's obviously an amazing person that can really help you work through things that you might not be able to work through yourself. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, today. Today's episode is one that's really close to my heart. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've loved the knowledge and the wisdom that Brandon has been sharing with us today. I think trauma is one of those topics that we just don't talk about enough, that people just brush under the carpet a little bit and might not feel comfortable talking about. But in order to live really fulfilled and really, deep and meaningful lives, I think it's really important to actually work through traumas that we might have experienced and look at them a little bit closer and, resolve them, because it really can make a difference in your everyday life. I really hope that the knowledge and the information that has been talked about today is also useful for you. Please do share the podcast with family, with friends, with anybody that you think might be benefiting from this information. Let's get the conversation out there. Let's talk about it more. Like Brandon said as well, especially in a time like now, it's needed more than ever, really. I really hope this episode brought some sunshine to your soul. I'm sending love and light your way, and until next time.